surely we can find some sort of way to make these markets work for us, not just us work for the markets.
Talmon Smith is an economics reporter for the New York Times, based out of New York City. Before joining the business desk, as a staff editor in the opinion section covering public policy, economics, culture, from New Orleans, not a bad town. Excited to have Tal on today. His background brings him pretty wide around the sphere of economics, labor, culture, policy. Graduate of Tufts University, Harvard Institute of Politics National Campaign Ambassador. He's a former fellow at the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. He's worked as a policy writer and researcher, a nonpartisan campaign finance think tank. He was a speaker at Frontiers of Democracy and the President's dedication ceremony of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate. His current research entails anatomizing the roots of regulatory capture, dependence corruption, conflicts of interest, produced by the current campaign finance system. So what the heck are we talking to this dude about when it comes to future of work? Well, I'll tell you. A few weeks ago, we had David Fahrenthold, another reporter for the New York Times, join us. Tal and David published an article in the New York Times titled How Restaurant Workers Help Pay for Lobbying and to Keep Their Wages Low. The National Restaurant Association using mandatory $15 food safety classes to turn waiters and cooks into unwitting funders of its battle against minimum wage increases. Was excited to talk to David. Now we're going to talk to Tal. Let's bring it in.
So maybe we start there. Like, how did you come upon this revelation around the ServSafe and the national restaurant? What teed it off?
Yeah, so it was kind of like a part 1, part 2, part 3 thing where David actually came to me because I think I'm remembering this correctly. He had a source from his days at the Post that was just like, hey man, like I know you don't really cover restaurants or anything like that, but the NRA, the National Restaurant Association, they have this like sort of odd, deft, clever thing they got going on. I'm not sure if it's all above board. You might want to check it out. And he actually, I don't know whether he, came up to me in the office or shot me an email first, but we ended up getting together at headquarters in New York. Usually David's based in DC. And he kind of gave me the basics that he first knew. And he was like, do you know anybody at the National Restaurant Association? Because I had done a sort of broad-based, I guess, like explanatory / investigative piece back in late summer, early fall, into just the widespread prevalence of wage theft and underpay, whether intentional or accidental, and just low real wages overall in the restaurant industry, due in part to the sub-minimum wage that hospitality workers are allowed to be paid in most states. And I was like, yeah, I still know folks over there. I'm not sure how much they like me, but we're in touch. And I started doing a little bit of digging. I kind of had my own little scooplet that I found, and then David and I just started mind melding. He whipped out a spreadsheet. I got some tax data that wasn't yet public from the National Restaurant Association, and or on them. And yeah, and we just spent a good couple of months seeing what we had here, and thanks to a lot of really kind people talking to us both on and off the record, we were able to piece it together, and then teamed up with some really brilliant folks in our data team who I think David might even explain this to you before, helped us get a baseline number in terms of just how many folks the National Restaurant Association were able to have participate in these classes, which are almost boring in their brilliance, and that it only costs $15 on an individual basis, right? Doesn't it's kind of this annoyance. It's not a huge deal, but add up millions and millions and millions of workers, and you get to that $25 million number that we found that the Restaurant Association was able to get, which more than covered their lobbying cost. So pretty sweet deal for them. It's also tax free, since they get to be categorized as a nonprofit. So it's it's clever, and for others it's a real outrage.
What surprised you most as you really dug in kind of through those, the rounds and rounds of work you did?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up nerding out, especially on the legal aspect of it. I mean, I think as always, feel the most like a capital J journalist when I'm, in the weeds with, all types of workers. And it was a shock to realize that, like, even, very savvy veteran cooks, waitresses, managers didn't quite understand this connection. That was quite the surprise. But I remember just talking to legal sources in DC, like tax experts, folks that understand the ins and outs of what 501c6 is, which is what the NRA is. It's a business league, what they're able to do and not do. And they're like, man, they're pushing it, but but it looks like this passes muster, right? Because as long as the National Restaurant Association is a business league generally furthering the interest of the industry at large for its benefit, then it's able to basically run a business from within the nonprofit, which leads again to that situation where not only did they have this awesome gravy train funded by workers going, but that it doesn't get taxed. It makes it that much more thrifty. So I was just surprised by the ways that the legal structures that we have in place in our economy allowed them to do what they did. And they have a lot of smart lawyers over there at the National Restaurant Association, and so I'm sure to the extent that the IRS will or will not ever have a problem with this, they'll be prepared. But so far it seems like they're in the clear.
There were a ton of really powerful stories in the piece, and I'm sure you talked to many more than maybe didn't even make it into their specific stories. And I remember I think it was my Sheka from talked about her experience at Carl's Jr. And I think the quote was something to the effect of, sitting here, I'm working hard, I'm paying money, I can work in this job, and at the end of the day, I just still don't even have enough for my family. As a economics reporter, can you talk a little bit about the weight? You said you made a point sub minimum wage. Be cool to explain to folks what that is. And there's this position of raising the minimum wage on a restaurant worker is just going to result in less jobs and closed restaurants, and it's going to be bad for everybody. I don't know. Can you talk a little bit to the economics of wages in this industry, and why is there such an attack on doing anything to raise them?
Yeah. So just to start off right where you did, the sub minimum wage, as many of your listeners may know, is the legal wage floor that businesses can pay any given worker, as long as they make tips, with the idea that, well, if you're taking one of these jobs, you're not just getting paid a flat rate and then that's whatever you have, and you take that home at the end of the week or at the end of a biweekly pay period. No, you have customers directly giving you money. So it's actually fine for us to lower the floor for you, because in reality you're going to make way more than the minimum wage anyway. For some workers that is true, and so that bargain works. I think we've all, well, hopefully all of us have had the fortune of, at least occasionally going to, a pretty fancy restaurant, and the young man or woman there is probably, taking home, in some cases, hundreds of dollars in a night. But I think, as more of us know, uh, most restaurants are not fancy restaurants, and no matter what type of restaurant or bar or hotel you may work at as an employee, there's rainy days, there are wintry days in a lot of parts of the country. There are slow days. There's often more slow days than busy days, and in that case, if you're getting paid only 213 in the worst cases, and there are still plenty of states, including Louisiana, where I'm from, which in New Orleans, right? That's a hospitality heavy city, and that's where I'm from most specifically. You can still indeed get paid 213, and it's not as uncommon as some data might have you think. But also in New York, it's rising, but you make less than the $15 minimum wage in the general New York City area. And even that, considering the cost of living in New York, can feel a lot like making only $2 an hour. To the point of, the economic arguments that, look, you don't want to arbitrarily raise wage floors, in a way that is not just tied to the natural flow of markets. I'd say two things. I think first, we like to create this dichotomy in which on the left hand we have the market, and on the right hand we have the government, and these are different things. In reality, every single market that we have is dictated by some sort of rule or regulation, and when there's a lack of rules or regulations, that is also by omission a form of government choice, or carving, shaping a business environment. So I'd say that first, but then secondly, I do think it is important to concede that there is a situation in which a minimum wage might be, at least hypothetically, too high, right? And cause mass business closure because of a sudden rise in labor costs that most businesses can't handle. You see in some other countries like Turkey, a lot of economists have been critical of the large hikes in the minimum wage that leaders over there have done, with the idea that it's well intentioned, but only going to that it's not going to help solve their cost of living crisis, with that, which have to do with you know in their case, a bunch of really crazy things with currency, and them not potentially having enough real resources, to service their needs as a society. I do not think, based on the research that I've seen from sources I most trust, that taking the minimum wage closer to what say the MIT living wage calculator suggests, over a period of time that allows all businesses to adjust and be on an even playing field, there is still risk, but I'd say that the risk is much lower. And then just lastly, and then I'll hand things back to you. I know I've been going on for a bit here. It is very odd when I see some responses to the reporting that I've done over the past year on the hospitality industry. It's odd to see people say, like, why are you even doing this reporting? Like, nobody makes minimum wage anymore anyway. To which I say, one, yes, there's a lot of people that technically don't make the minimum wage, but they're a dollar or two over it. And often that, that doesn't make a real difference in people's lives. Ben Zipperer at EPI, a think tank, has actually created this really awesome dial, which shows you how many workers in America make less than a given amount over an hour. And I think a lot of people will be surprised how many people still make below 15, and really, really surprised how many people make below 20, because that number is even larger. And so I, I, I think if the minimum wage didn't matter, it wouldn't matter, and it would probably just be higher because nobody would care. But people do care, which suggests that there is some fear of profit margins being eaten into. So
and
it's
I think
a complex thing.
and I think what you just said is so important, because again, if there's this position of you know, I think you got to start at minimum wage if you're having a discussion around hospitality, because what has happened over the last year and a half is this position that there's a labor shortage. You know, you hear certain brands will say, we can't find workers, there's a labor shortage. And then, you know, that'll shift into, even when we do find them, they don't have the right skills. So now it's not really just a labor shortage, it's a labor shortage with the right skills. And, you know, then here comes the National Restaurant Association, who's supposed to be, you know, the advocate for the whole industry, not just the brands, but also the people in it. And what they're putting forth is a offering that claims to be skill development, which I guess if you come back to you take a stutter step back, if we're missing skills, let's provide skills. If it really is that, then let's do it. But instead of doing that, you're doing something that's like ServSafe, which is not skill building. And in many ways, I would argue is a cruel joke to say that, you know, you're forcing a low wage worker, back to the wage piece, to have to do something that really doesn't raise any element of their skill sets, other than to just remind them of the fact that, like, of things they already know, which is like, don't go to the bathroom and then like touch the hamburger. You know, this training is not, you know, elevating a dishwasher into a sommelier by going through this program.
No. It's certainly not. And the impression I got from both business owners, managers, and employees is that, I mean, the real training that you get is on the job, from your supervisors, from your coworkers. There is an extent to which the Restaurant Association does have this certification that can often feel like just a stamp, a formality, maybe, if you're going to be, you know, really ungenerous. But I do understand in the general impulse to have safety certification. I mean, I think the idea of food safety and health inspection and all the things of that sort are things that most people can probably get behind if you just told them offhand. I'm not sure if you told them that a system counting tips toward the minimum wage is, you know, being fought in many places, and the people, you know, pushing back against workers are being funded by the workers. You know, I think that's when, you know, folks get a little bit more, I guess, torn. It is true on the labor shortage front that, you know, compared to the labor force participation that we had in, say, the turn of the millennium, that has gone down. But a lot of that's structural, not cultural. You know, baby boomers, you know, started hitting the oldest of them started hitting the back half of middle age in around 2000. And ever since then, you know, considering for a long time that was our largest generation, there's just been a lot of people retiring out of the workforce. And you've also not seen the sort of immigration levels that, you know, America experienced for much of the 20th century. So that adds up to, you know, a generally slower growing population. You know, it is interesting on that note, because I feel like there are others that are better experts at the ins and outs of labor availability. But I will say that there does seem to be two brands of, you know, hoping for, you know, an expansion of the labor force, especially when it comes through immigration, which is the idea that if we could, you know, just have a steady supply of workers to fit our growing economy, our economy could just structurally be healthier. And yet I think there's a more pernicious idea that maybe isn't as pro-social, that if we could just get the Hondurans and the other Central Americans and the Mexicans, you know, flowing back across the border, hopefully legally, again, then, you know, they'll be so happy to be, you know, taking $11 an hour, that, that'll really cool wage pressure. And that way we don't have to, you know, be as challenged by the labor movement. And that's I think, a really complicated dynamic for people, because I think there's a lot of folks that for all sorts of reasons, love the idea of immigration and the dynamism it brings to the economy, to society, to culture. And yet it is true that there are certain business interests that see the opportunity of being able to give somebody that is new to this country, a quadrupling of pay, that could also help them stymie the pay of, the native based workforce. And that brings up all sorts of awkward, both public policy and economic questions that, I'm not well equipped to give a prescription for, but it's certainly a fascinating dynamic I've seen emerging over the past few years.
You mentioned some of the feedback you'd received, and I looked at the comments feed on this article, and there you got a lot of comments. There's a lot of comments.
Yeah.
I usually stay away from the comments section and stuff because but I'm sure you in your line of work are always checking
a little
it out.
rowdy in there.
Yeah, there's definitely. But were there any reactions that surprised you that you didn't expect?
I was surprised at the level of surprise. But I was also then, I don't know if surprise is the word, but disheartened maybe by the the continued misunderstanding, and maybe it means I need to do a better job reporting, of there being a binary trade-off here of, either we get rid of tips and, decide what will just be the new higher or wage floor, or keep the same wage floor, index the wage floor to inflation, whatever, the public agrees upon. Or we just have to have, our current system. And there's a lot of states where that's not the case. There are a lot of states where you just make the wage floor or at least the wage floor, right? That's the nature of it being a floor. But then you get tips on top, right? And it's not just California and Oregon and, Washington State. It's also Montana and Alaska. So, there's a lot of different ways that ideologically diverse people can, restructure this this market. It is true that some people, don't want to change this system, in any sort of way, tips or no tips. And that's something that I think is also interesting to wrestle with. I mean, there is a way in which the story of the 2010s in some way was that certain technologies allowed, the middle class to feel upper middle class, and the upper middle class to feel, maybe even affluent, right? When you think of Uber, which is essentially just limos on demand, right? And I say this as a person that, is a relatively frequent Uber user. And I remember when it was really cheap. And I remember when everybody started getting very upset when it became more expensive. And part of that reason, though not as large of a reason as, some might hope, is because, there were adjustments to driver pay. And so I think that sometimes the idea of trade-offs are just being set in stone isn't quite true. Much of the economy isn't zero sum, but I do think that the middle class of this country has really come to like that going out is still relatively cheap. And they're, while labor costs are not, the end all be all of what creates a price, labor is an input into price. And, one way to keep prices low is to massively suppress, the pay of the workers that help create it or help create the experience. And so that's another interesting sort of not just policy, but societal question for us, to the extent that paying workers in the hospitality industry more may raise prices, at least somewhat. Are people okay with that? It's
some benefit from it, maybe more than just the restaurant owner or the brand owner.
Right.
How did the NRA respond?
Well, they declined to comment on the record, which didn't.
How about off the record?
Yeah, off the record, I have to keep mostly off the record, but they were not pleased, but I think they had to respect. I mean, we were respectful as always. We had to represent the Times in the way that they would want us to, and that we would want to. But there were frank, direct conversations. But at the end of the day, they were mostly about ensuring that we got the facts right. And on that front, they put out some information saying that we were misleading and this or that. But they had, in our direct conversations with them, we laid out, hey, this is what we're going with. Let us, see if there's any red flag here. That all went through, and that's why we published. If you got the goods, you got the goods.
Sure. Tal, I appreciate you taking time. I appreciate your reporting on this. I mean, I think it's such a, I know that in the folks that I had this shared with me, probably 6 or 7 different ways from folks. It was when it first came out, so much about what I think this affects, is this conversation around future of work, and wages are part of the discussion. How we skill people up are part of the discussion. How we treat people are part of the discussion. And I guess just final question for you. What is your hope for the future of work?
Man, yeah, that's a good one. I think that however we get there, and my job isn't really to dictate how we get there or what it looks like, but however we get there and whatever it looks like, no matter whether it culturally reads as something that leans left or leans right or uses market mechanisms or uses government input, I'm agnostic in terms of that. But I think a society in which the bottom 50% of this country, which currently has an average annual income of $28,000, I hope that the other half, so to speak, of this country can find a way to just have their standards of living raised, so that they can enjoy life, not stress-free, but with a sense of dignity and hopefulness and stability. Because I think, considering the massive amounts of wealth that capitalism has brilliantly created for us, $137 trillion or more in total family wealth in this country, surely we can find some sort of way to make these markets work for us, not just us work for the markets.
Tal, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, my man.
We shouldn't just make us work for the markets. We need to make the markets work for us. Enjoy the conversation with Tal. Ton of big stuff here. 3.6 million people have taken this ServSafe training. At the same time, it makes you think about the structure and the system in place at a time when so many organizations outside of restaurants, all corners of the workforce, are saying things like workers are unskilled, unprepared, low skilled. But at the same time, are we doing everything we can to really offer the education, training, mentorship to close those gaps, or are we just paying lip service to it with programs like ServSafe? In 2020, 1.1 million workers earned at or below the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, and it hasn't budged in over a decade. Most states today even allow restaurant and other service workers to be paid a sub-minimum wage, a meager $2.13 an hour, and that forces nearly 5 million workers in America today to survive on tips. For background, where did the concept of a sub-minimum wage come from? Well, slavery. After emancipation, restaurant owners hired formerly enslaved black workers for free, and they had to rely on customers' tips, charity, in order to get by. This is indisputable. It is a fact. And as I think about what Tal shares, what David shared, the scenario of taking from frontline workers who have so little, creating a system where those who are paid the least pay the most, we have to pause and ask ourselves, what kind of future of work are we really all about? Are we about creating a space where everybody can compete, where our front line can become our full-time, where the back of house can become the front of house? If we're really about it, we probably should start acting like it. Thanks to Talmon Smith for joining us in this episode. Go follow him with the New York Times. Some awesome investigative reports that have been coming out over the last bunch of months. I've enjoyed reading some of this stuff. Now, don't forget to subscribe to Bring It In so you never miss an episode. We've got some awesome guests lined up that you're not going to want to miss. Now, back to work.